Hey everyone, thanks for joining the show. Waiting on Bill to join, and we'll get this started. Thanks everybody for coming in. Come on in. Thank you. Let's make sure Bill has the invite. All right.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, good. So happy you're here. I know I jumped on a little early. I didn't realize it was going to go live.
Oh, we are live. Okay, that's fine. But
We're live. We're rocking and rolling. Everybody is super eager for this one. So I'm really grateful to have you on the show, Bill. So
thanks for having me.
we've got Bill Bishop, who is one of the preeminent experts on China. And, I think last week everyone sort of woke up to the new world order. We've been seeing it happen, creep and creep. We've seen the creep, right? But when you have Keir Starmer, the prime minister in the UK, the Labour prime minister, visit China, he's obviously sending a message to Washington. What were you thinking when you saw that news, when you saw his meeting, when he met with Xi?
So it's interesting. I think that from the Chinese perspective, this isn't necessarily anything particularly sudden. They've had
Mm.
a stream of uh, a
Sorry about that.
stream no, worries, a stream of European leaders arriving in Beijing or on their way. I think French President Macron was there, I think, in December. You've had the Finnish prime minister was there a few days before Starmer. The German chancellor is heading there in a couple weeks, I think. And so and then of course you had the Canadian prime minister there, who had made some comments that I think were more stark than either Macron or the UK Prime Minister made in terms of a sort of the changing world order as they see it. And so I think this is just on the one hand, it makes sense for these countries to try and have stable relations with the PRC, but at the same time that it's coming amidst the backdrop of what is I think a much more turbulent relationship with their traditional ally, the US. And so I think last week, the optics of the visit, specifically the UK Prime Minister's visit, were frankly not particularly favorable. I think for the British side,
Mm.
the Prime Minister really looked like a supplicant. He didn't actually get much. He's on the Prime Minister's on Substack. Keir Starmer is on
Yeah.
Substack, and he posted. You can probably put it in the link. And he posted a piece over the weekend just titled "China," where he was sort of a political defense of his trip to China and why it was important to have a more sophisticated relationship with China, and then they've wasted 8 years of sort of doing nothing, which again is, I mean, politicians all exaggerate, right? That's what you cover that on a regular basis, right? The
Mm.
hyperbole, but I think that ultimately, this. The Brits got among the big wins for the Brits were the tariffs on whiskey went from 10% to 5%.
Mhm.
Which again, it's not, I don't think, can have much of an impact, but that certainly can be touted as a win. He claimed two something billion dollars worth of investments and two something billion dollars worth of exports, but again, it's not really clear. We know from other national leaders who make big claims about investment and trade deals,
Yeah.
that we're not actually sure
Projected
what
investment that never
right.
happens.
Um, but what you have is, I think, over the last few months, certainly from the way the British, you know, parts of the British political establishment have been attacking the current prime minister. You have what they claim is really a bit of a kowtowing on towards China. You had the last year the UK government rolled out this sort of foreign registration tier where foreign actors had to register, and they were the highest tier. Um, Originally, people thought it would be China would be included in that, and then it ended up only being Iran and Russia, because of very special interests that were concerned, specifically my understanding in the financial sector, that were concerned that putting China in the highest tier would cause problems for business. You had a spy case that was effectively dissolved on the eve of trial last
Mm.
fall. because again, you never underestimate the sort of the potential for a real cock up. I did a live on this with one of the actual expert witnesses for the prosecution a few months ago, um, but really it was more, I think, that the British government had sort of changed and downgraded its assessment of the threat from China, and so it was no longer the prosecution was no longer able to argue that these two men had committed crimes that they were alleged to have committed, and so that case was dropped. And then of course there was this massive new embassy that the Chinese purchased this property, the Royal Mint, several years ago, and it's been stuck in kind of planning purgatory. And the Chinese side had made it very clear that there would be no Starmer visit until planning was unlocked and this embassy was allowed to go forward. And so, of course, the decision was made 2 weeks ago, and then the trip was confirmed. UK Prime Minister Starmer and a delegation, I think, of 60 business executives, then showed up in Beijing about a week later.
Yeah, I mean, the British press is pretty brutal. We all know
Yes,
that.
they they are very skilled at being brutal.
Yes, exactly. That's where you cut your teeth, right? Fleet Street. And the Daily Mail, they really, slapped him across the face for going there. They felt like he came home empty-handed, like you said. Uh, the Tories, it is obviously a Tory paper. Tories have always been pretty hawkish on China. When is the last time a prime minister from the UK has visited China, or she?
I think it was 8 years, 8 or 7 or 8 years. Of course, part of that was COVID, but then part of it was just the general that there was, the general downturn in the relationship. There are issues over Hong Kong. There are issues over there's a UK citizen, Jimmy Lai, who's been convicted of various national security related crimes in Hong Kong, and they're awaiting sentencing. He's in his mid to late 70s. Health isn't great. He's most likely going to die in prison.
Yeah.
And again, this is another area where there were some voices in the UK that were hoping that the UK Prime Minister would be a little tougher on that. But clearly, he says he raised it privately, but um, nothing has come of that. And so I think ultimately that the UK signed on to the Biden administration approach to China, trying to build more of a united front to take sort of a more of a concerted, tougher line towards China. This then goes back, I think, to your opening question, which is that for these countries, the phrase people use is middle powers like the UK, like Canada. Why, the question becomes, why are we sacrificing some at least commercial interests with the second largest economy in the world when we're being treated, as they see it, they're being treated like increasingly like dirt by their traditional ally, the US. And
Right.
so, you can, I think you can make a pretty cogent argument for why there should be more engagement. While it is important that like the UK and the PRC are talking, or Canada and the PRC are talking, I think the mistake is if you see the leaders of those countries decide that somehow the PRC is more stable or more reliable than the US is. And I'm not, UK Prime Minister Starmer, I think he's been pretty clear that's not where they are. The Canadian Prime Minister, a little bit not less clear. And you think about it from Beijing's perspective, you have two of the historically staunchest US allies, two NATO members, and also two members of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance. The
Yep.
UK, it's Australia, UK, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. So just in the last 3 weeks, you've had the UK and the Canadian leaders in China um, effectively, in some ways bending the knee to Beijing. And so, whether or not, this isn't like some sort of binary, all of a sudden they flipped, but it's progress towards opening up or exploiting growing fissures in the US relationship with these two staunch allies. And that, that's a positive for Beijing, however you cut it.
Yeah. Donald Trump called the meeting very dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Like,
I mean, that's the question. So what? So now we're gonna threaten them again. We supposedly have a
right.
trade deal. And where does this go? And where is it okay? On the one hand, the US is cutting a trade deal. President Trump is clearly focused on cutting a big deal with China. He is, his administration has put a hold on all sorts of actions against China because they don't want to mess up the current trade deal, and they don't want to mess up the April, big state visit to China that President Trump is planning. So one of the questions would be, well, these are sovereign countries. Why don't they have the right to also cut deals?
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, you get past the headlines, and the two countries, at least the UK, I think there still are constructive conversations underway, so that it won't be this kind of you can run the risk of, oh, excuse me, my dog has come back and wants a treat. I apologize. Tashi, come on, buddy. But ultimately, I think that my guess will be that the UK will manage the US relationship a bit better than I think the Prime Minister Carney has been doing. And so what Trump threatens, I mean, again, when you look at like, there are other things that we need from the UK. We're working with them on Ukraine. And so I think it is just the President Trump can make all these threats, but it's what getting beyond the sort of the pretty nasty partisan UK press and the political attacks in the UK. What Prime Minister Starmer agreed to in terms of substance wasn't really that interesting.
Mm, okay. So, and Starmer also said he won't choose between the US and China. Is that really sustainable, or do you think Trump will force him to make a choice?
I mean, I think that ultimately, I think that I don't think the U.S. or President Trump administration is crazy enough to try and make them somehow choose because, I mean, ultimately, y- y- again, what the UK has, sorry, what the UK has stopped, what the UK agreed to in this trip, it doesn't really fit the US, right? The Canadian agreement is a little worse because, or potentially riskier because the Canadians are now allowing in a certain number of these connected new energy vehicles, these EVs, which the
Right.
US doesn't allow in the country. The UK is already is already a very large market for Chinese EVs, and so this has been going on for years in the UK. So again, it's not clear on what grounds the President Trump would have to sort of threaten the UK over Starmer's visit because as bad as the optics are, it isn't like Starmer is suddenly turning over the country to the Chinese. I mean, even things like the UK, this new embassy that the UK has approved um, for the PRC, you've seen. I think the House Select Committee on China issued a letter talking about some of the risks and the biggest risks around this embassy that have been highlighted publicly are around these fiber optic cables that run adjacent to the site. And the concern is the Chinese could somehow tap into them and they are carrying
Mm,
sensitive data. The US government, my understanding, has not actually, like the US intelligence community has not issued any public statement. The UK intelligence services had said they can mitigate the risks from these cables. And so again, from parts of the U.S. government, it's not at all clear that they're that upset with what's going
mm,
on. So, ultimately, I think so far, Starmer has shown a pretty good ability to kind of mollify President Trump, I think. And then you've got today or tomorrow, I think we've got a rare earths summit, a critical mineral summit in DC. I believe the UK is part of that. The US, the Trump administration is trying to put together a pretty significant consortium to deal with or to try and mitigate the risks from the PRC stranglehold on, critical mineral supply chains. And so, moving past these sort of truth social, I mean, depending on what time of day threats he makes,
yeah.
uh, um, ultimately, again, I think, I mean, never say never with President Trump, but it would certainly be unfortunate, and I think somewhat unjustified to sort of go, get really harsh on the UK because this trip again, optics aren't great. Substance really doesn't seem that particularly interesting or problematic at this point. It just frankly from and I'll be honest with you, and this is something you've covered a lot, is Starmer's bigger problem is Epstein and Mandelson.
Mm.
Um, and ultimately, there's this.
Of course, it all goes
No, no,
back to
no. It
Epstein.
all goes back to Epstein, but ultimately it goes Mandelson. He was UK's ambassador to the DC for at the beginning of the Trump administration, right?
Yeah.
And he had as some of his clients, he had Chinese interests as his clients, including Huawei. Starmer may end up with a bigger China problem because of stuff that comes out of these Mandelson revelations from the Epstein files than his China trip. As you said,
Mm.
it all goes back to this disgusting creep.
Network. Yeah.
Yeah, network.
Yeah, because he couldn't have lived without his network or sustained what he was doing without this network of powerful people.
Right.
Um, just to go back to what you mentioned about the rare earth minerals, you're talking about the new mineral reserve that worth nearly $12 billion that
That
Trump.
Bloomberg wrote about. Yeah.
Yeah, that do you think it could actually counter China's dominance on the hard
Yes.
process? Okay.
I mean, I think there's a real impetus now among many like-minded countries to to finally try and break China's stranglehold on these critical minerals. Even though China's been telling the world they've been going to do this for basically the last 15 years or so, and everyone, there were lots of academic and policy sort of studies, lots of admiration of the problem. No one really did anything until basically the Xi Jinping called Trump and Besant's bluff last year, and uh, proved that he has a lot of power over the U.S. And so basically was again achieved a victory in the first round of this latest U.S.-China trade war. And so I think that the Trump administration was pretty sobered by how much you remember early on last year in the beginnings of I think around Tariff Liberation Day last April,
Yeah.
Treasury Secretary Bessent, in one of, honestly, perhaps one of the dumbest statements of the year, said that China was playing with a hand of a pair of twos. And then very quickly, I think he realized actually China was playing with a lot of leverage and was able to call the Trump administration bluff around rare earths and force effectively a truce. And not only a truce for the deal that was announced last November in South Korea, but also for the U.S. for the Trump administration to basically put a stop on any new measures that might upset the Chinese around technology, around certain types of sanctions, around trade investigations from semiconductors to pharmaceuticals, and so there is a real recognition in the U.S. government and allied capitals that. Uh, this is a massive risk that the Chinese control over the critical minerals, rare earth supply chains is a huge point of leverage for them and a massive risk. And so I think at this point now, you do have enough minds focused that there will be a much more significant effort to try and break that stranglehold, but it's not something that's going to happen in a year or 2 years, right? I mean, you had
Yeah.
Secretary Bessent a few months ago went on CNBC. He was at one of these rare earth facilities and startups in South Carolina. He held up a magnet and said, "We're making magnets here now," and they are, but they're making not very many, right? And so
Yeah.
it's still a ways off, but this is an important initiative, and so I think. We should all it's actually positive, and this goes back to, on the one hand, you have, say, President Trump, he'll threaten on True Social,
Yeah.
but at the same time the actual bureaucracies in many areas are still working together. And so that's where I think it's important to not to sort of look at the relationship, as we were talking about the UK, is it's not binary. There's a lot of different facets, and in many areas the US and the UK are still working together around what they consider to be challenge, or they've diagnosed as challenges with China.
So what tools does the US have though? Like tariffs, trade restrictions, security pressures? Like how effective are these tools anyway?
So the U.S. has, there, in addition to tariffs, there are a fair number of areas where the U.S. still has um, a lot of leverage around key inputs that the Chinese need. I mean, clearly semiconductors are one, and while the Trump administration has not relaxed the controls on semiconductor equipment, manufacturing equipment that the Biden administration put in place, or the first Trump did, and then the Biden administration expanded upon them. They did allow, of course, not the most cutting edge, but very good, better than the Chinese can make NVIDIA chips to now be sold into China again. They had some leverage if before the South Korea deal last fall, when things were suddenly got pretty dicey and it looked like the deal they thought they had was falling apart. The U.S. threatened uh, restrictions on exports around commercial aircraft, jet engines, certain types of chemicals. There are areas where the U.S. has leverage, but the problem, part of the problem is using that leverage would cause a lot of pain for U.S. companies. But then at the
Okay.
same time, the Chinese have really quite skillfully built over the last 15 to 20 years significant leverage over key supply chains in the U.S. with their rare earths related, uh, their dominance of the rare earths processing industry and the rare earths magnets industry. And that, I think, ultimately, the Chinese have the ability to cause significant chaos in important parts of the U.S. Industrial manufacturing industries in this country. And that is where I think the Trump administration saw that, and that's where they blinked last fall. And
Yeah.
The Chinese were not, the tariffs hurt them. They would prefer to have lower tariffs. They've gotten to a point where with the US China deal, they've gotten to a point where the tariffs are, they like them to be lower, but they're manageable, right? They can
Really?
adjust. They
Yeah.
can adjust, and
Because
they
they
can
don't really
adjust.
care about it's a communist country. There's people aren't gonna
Well, I mean, a lot of the exports come from companies that that do care about profit, but they have they have the ability to operate on very low margins. The
right.
government is giving certain subsidies like export credits, export support. They also have the ability to transship through other countries that have lower tariffs with the
Mm.
U.S. And so there's it's not ideal. They would like to be lower, but it is not sort of, oh my God, the tariffs are 45% or where they are now, and therefore all these Chinese businesses are gonna, it's gonna collapse, right? Because again, there was I think, um, starting at the beginning of the this Trump administration last year, there I think was a pretty significant error in the diagnosis of the um, fragility of the Chinese economy, where I think the U.S. side really overestimated how much leverage they had and underestimated the leverage the Chinese had, specifically in rare earths. And that's where we ended up by the end of last year into today. Um, Really a pretty significant truth that ultimately I think is, if you're on the Chinese leadership side, I think you have to say that, or you have to believe that they did like as bad as good a job as they could have hoped for in managing the Trump administration in the first year. And then at the same time, because of the way the Trump administration has been stressing traditional alliances and traditional partners, um, it's creating a lot of space for the Chinese to improve their position with countries like the UK, countries like Canada that more traditionally would have been, or at least even recently in the Biden administration, were much more on taking a united front against China with the U.S.
Okay. So just like, do you think that China is actively poaching our allies, or are they just filling a vacuum right now in terms of leadership?
Well, I think that the Chinese are actively trying to, there you saw it from the speech that the Vice Premier Ho Feng gave at Davos last month. I mean, you hear it and regularly see it in the sort of the way they're talking. Xi Jinping's talking in meetings with other leaders. The sort of what they're putting out in official media, official propaganda channels is really, they're portraying China as the force for stability and predictability in the world, right? Against this they describe the U.S. as the biggest source of instability now in the world. And when they look at, I don't think they believe that they're suddenly going to flip a traditional U.S. ally to, oh, we're gonna, we're gonna give up on the U.S. and we're gonna become an ally of China. But again, that isn't their goal. That they just want to be able to exploit the growing space between the US and its traditional allies. And, with, for example, this UK trip, there's the business deals, there's deals around people to people exchanges. You've already seen the UK government in preparation for this trip. They made some concessions around approving this embassy. This spy case was withdrawn. Again, the UK government will say it had nothing to do with this trip, but certainly from China's perspective, I think you can see, okay, the UK is moving more towards a less of a aggressive confrontational approach to China and more of a we can do business with them kind of approach, which is again as best as they can hope for in the short term. And then over time, if the US keeps stressing these relationships with threats of whatever they may threaten to do over the UK's Starmer's visit to UK to China, or over Greenland, although maybe Greenland is now resolved. I don't know. But that those just present opportunities for the Chinese. You think about like water; they can just sort of move into the cracks and the fissures that are created, and over time they can sort of expand things and sort of change for them. Again, just make it so that these countries are more amenable and more pliant towards China's uh, uh, offers and desires.
Do you think the long-term strategy is to weaken Western alliances during this administration?
I think honestly, in some ways, the long term strategy is just to watch the U.S. do it to themselves and then see where they can exploit those weaknesses.
Mm,
I think that is something they want. That has certainly been a goal. I mean, if you think about it, in the last year or so, the Biden administration, the Chinese side was getting extremely exercised over this talk about Asia expanding to NATO because there was talk about having NATO open an office in Japan, a lot of
mm,
talk about Taiwan. And now, of course, with Greenland, with Ukraine,
yeah.
NATO itself is under stress. There's no more discussion of NATO expanding into Asia. That is a win for Beijing,
Mm,
but they didn't
right.
really have to do anything.
It's kind of like the Democrats. They can just sit on their hands during this.
I will see if the Democrats are as smart as the Chinese are at sort of exploiting this chaos.
Yeah. So have we ever seen versions of this playbook during prior US administrations? I'm guessing, or is this a different moment fundamentally than ever
I
before?
think this is a different moment fundamentally. I mean, there certainly was, China. There's a lot of different things sort of um, coalescing at the same time, right? China has never been this powerful or this important or this influential in the world. You also, I think, this second Trump administration is uh, extreme anomaly in sort of U.S. Political history and in sort of U.S. foreign policy, and so it's hard to find any period that is really directly analogous to what's going on. I mean, it really is. Xi Jinping for years has liked to use this sort of say that the world is changing in ways unseen in 100 years, and you know, he started saying that maybe not quite a decade ago, and he's right, right? I mean, look at what's going on. I mean, all these changes are accelerating, and this whatever the previous world order was, and a lot of it, and I think Canadian Prime Minister Carney in his speech, he sort of talked about how this rules-based international order was sort of there, but not everyone necessarily always, not everyone actually lived up to it, and but you could at least have a fig leaf that it was there. I mean, the fig leaf is just gone. And then, so now everyone, I think, is trying to figure out, well, what's next? And so you have these middle powers like, the countries in the EU, like the UK, like Japan, who I think would much prefer a world where they can rely on the US, but also now are in a position where they need to start thinking a lot more about how they hedge. And
Right.
that's an own goal from the US.
I know you're talking about the middle powers, but what about South Korea, which was another one of our allies that we have a frayed relationship now? It looks like they're growing closer to Xi. There have been
I,
crackdowns on
I
US
I mean, I
companies.
mean, we have a treaty alliance with them. We have a lot of U.S. troops in South Korea. They have an existential threat across their border in North Korea. The current prime minister is more, um, I think, sort of more is known as being more leftist, more sort of sympathetic to China when he came in. He's again trying to hedge, but he's also trying to work with the U.S. And so it's more like these middle powers. I mean, they are stuck between two large and difficult countries. And the challenge, I think, is when people get sort of, and this is part of because of the rhetoric and some of the stuff the Trump administration is doing. It makes it easy for certainly people who have especially outside of the U.S., who have a general, I think, sort of anti-U.S. bent or disposition against the U.S. Um, to sort of compare the U.S. and China as like in terms of political systems and the way they're treating dissent and the way they're treating just a lot of things internally. And I'm not going to defend by any sense what the Trump administration is doing. We're still not like China, right? That
Mm,
may happen. I certainly hope it doesn't, but we're not there yet. And so I think the hope, but the problem is the hope that somehow the U.S. is going to revert to what it was. I mean, we're what, a year and a week or a year and 10 days into Trump too. I mean, it's going to get a lot worse. I mean, there's not a lot of. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it's certainly if had to bet, I think you would have to. The odds are high that it's going to get a lot worse here.
yeah, and it's actually one of the few powers President Trump will have with a Democratic Congress to deal with, is foreign policy.
We'll
Um,
see. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but yes, we'll see.
okay, you're right. We'll see what happens. You sort of led me into my last and final question. So it's 2028. Trump's leaving office. What does the US-China relationship look like?
That's a great question, and I think you know, if you think about the first Trump administration, the first year or so was really there was a lot of tension, the first trade war, and then actually, President Trump himself really seems to want to have a relatively positive relationship with China and with Xi Jinping. And so things, once they got the first trade deal done, things actually kind of stabilized, and then COVID happened, and then Trump
Mhm.
blamed China for COVID, and then things really kind of went off the rails. Uh, you know, from the Chinese perspective, I think again they believe they're in a quite a good spot with the U.S. both in terms of the bilateral relationship, but also with the way that the U.S. has been treating traditional partners and allies, and how that's creating space for China. If this April visit goes off well, if Trump does go to China, and I mean, his first visit in term one was like a state visit plus. So I don't know how they're going to top that. They opened up I mean, one of the things that's funny, right, is they gave him a private tour of the Forbidden City. They shut it down. He got to go into parts of the Forbidden City that like no foreign leaders get to go to. Starmer gets to go to the Forbidden City. They don't even shut it down. His video he makes, he's like all the tourists are just sort of walking around, right? So it was no, I mean, it
They're
was
like,
like
"Who's that
again,
guy?"
right. But to answer your question though, is my point is I think that um, on the current trajectory, the Chinese could actually be pretty confident that there might actually be a sort of a longer term stabilization where um, the U.S. China trade relationship has sort of it's didn't get as bad as they thought. The big issue, of course, is what happens around Taiwan, and the that one is as long as and I think as long as the Chinese side believes that there are political forces in Taiwan where that there may continue to be an opportunity for some sort of a peaceful deal in the way that the mainland wants it in terms of what they call reunification. Then uh, the Trump administration, it isn't clear how. Like whether it isn't clear how much support they're ultimately give Taiwan if there is the ability to have progress towards some sort of political deal. I mean, they're certainly the U.S. has been selling. They've had a big arms sale to Taiwan in
Yeah.
December. The National Defense Strategy doesn't talk about Taiwan, but it talks about the geography, the first island in the chain, in a way that makes it sound like they would defend Taiwan. Um, but ultimately, if the Chinese side, if there isn't some event or some reason that the Taiwan issue becomes uh, much more intense or gets closer to uh, some sort of whether it's a blockade or quarantine or God forbid some sort of a conflict. I think that ultimately the U.S. China relationship can be the Chinese, I think, can think they can actually manage it relatively well. And for them, they're not expecting the relationship to get like good like it used to be. They just want to keep it stable while they focus on building up their economy, reducing reliance on the US, picking off American allies, building their trade networks and their increasing other countries' reliance on China while insulating their economy and their financial system from the US. And that isn't going to stop based on happy talk or a nice visit from President Trump. And so they're very clear-eyed that this relationship is sort of in a long-term structural competition. But I do think after the first year or so, they've gotten more confident that they know how to manage Trump and his administration. I worry. I think there's a chance they're overconfident. But you know, again, we'll see. I mean, I'm so wary now of predicting anything that President Trump does. It's just like, you know, I mean, you look at what happened. Trump won. You look what happened last year. But from the Chinese perspective, I have to say that they really do think they have President Trump's number, and at least so far, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna end on that note. Came right to the half hour. Thank you so much, Bill. This was
Thank you.
illuminating. I
No,
hope
really
everyone
happy to be on your
enjoyed it.
big fan, happy subscriber. It's an honor to be on your
Yeah,
show. Thank
same
you.
here. I feel like I always learn so much from you, and it felt like a really important topic. And I know, as you said, the UK was not the first to visit, but one of our closest allies. And I
Yeah.
think was startling for a lot of Americans to see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then if the Starmer government falls because of Mandelson and Epstein, then maybe we'll, the conservatives are pretty hawkish on China, so you never know. It could flip quickly.
That's right. Only Epstein can change this.
Yes.
That's the answer. And if you want more Epstein news, go to the red
Yes.
letter. My latest on the guy leading the Epstein investigation, Jay Clayton, and how he is very closely tied with Leon Black, one of Epstein's closest allies, Leon Black had to leave his job because of his relationship with
Right.
Epstein. And then he picks Jay Clayton to succeed him, the guy who's now in charge of the Epstein investigation.
It's all gross.
Power
And
policing itself. I don't
and
know how else to describe it.
thank you for your coverage of it. It is all
Of
gross.
course. Thank you for your great coverage too. Well, thanks everyone for
Thank you.
tuning in, and sign and become subscribers to both of our channels if you're not
Yes.
already. We
Thank you.
appreciate your support. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.